all-time high. This is unacceptable. When governments know of a threat, they have an obligation to protect their citizens, which is why I'm resolved that preventive war is ethical. Before we get into that, let's make sure we're all talking about the same concept. We'll be defining preventive war from the United States Department of Defense. Quote, a war initiated in the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable, and that to delay would involve greater risk, end quote. There's one point of definitional clarification I'd like to provide before we go any further. Write it on your flow as 2 prongs. The definition clearly sets out what's required in order to go to preventive war. Write each prong down as a separate subpoint. Subpoint A, other options failed. In order to adequately meet the standard for preventive war, other options must have been tried and failed. Inevitable moves beyond perception and says that one is certain of an outcome. The government cannot prove a threat unavoidable until they have attempted multiple times to avoid it. Preventive war only targets the most serious threats. The second prong you can tag as rapid expansion. The second part of the definition, and to delay would cause greater risk, indicates that a threat is quickly growing and rapidly becoming even more dangerous. Now that we know what preventive warfare is, we need to figure out whether or not it's ethical. To define what ethicality will mean in our debate round, let's take a look at my value of citizens' lives. There's one reason to prefer this over anything my opponent might bring up. Write it on your flow as ethical priority. Governments have a lot of items on their to-do list. They'll put education, homelessness, drugs, healthcare, etc. But none of that matters if they fail their first obligation, protecting their people. The nations we look up to, such as the United States, Israel, and Britain, are success stories because their people are safe. Compare them to the nations of the Central Africa and the Middle East. Those nations are ethical failures. Their citizens are dying. No one cares that their roads aren't great, that they don't have public education, or that their drug laws stink. We care that their citizens have to dodge bullets and missiles every single day. Governments' ethics are based on what they're morally obligated to do, and their moral obligation in a threat situation is simple: keep their citizens alive. Now that we can measure ethicality, all that's left to do is take that and apply it to our resolution and my one and only contention. Write it on your flow as ethical governments prevent disaster. For centuries, we've understood that when people threaten our nation, that needs to be dealt with. In a 21st century world where one country with a nuke, or a few guys with a couple of planes can kill thousands, we have to evaluate our threats carefully. And if a military official truly believes the threat to be inevitable, leaving that threat to destroy thousands completely undermines the ethical responsibility of a government. Quick and effective military action can and will protect thousands, but you don't have to take my word for it. We can turn to a real-world application. Application 1, Operation Opera. The following information was sourced from Brandon's letter in his March 13, 2016 article on Stanford.edu. In 1976, the Israeli government was faced with a rare scenario. Their neighboring country, Iraq, was building a nuclear reactor to level and destroy major Israeli cities and neutralize thousands of innocent lives. Hussein started publicly saying the reactor was to be used against Israel. They tried peace treaties with Iraq, pensioning the UN Security Council, and peace treaties again. Nothing was working. In order to save their citizens, they initiated an air-based attack on June 7th of 1981. The attack was successful in destroying the nuke as well as the surrounding materials. Time frame? 2 minutes. Total civilian casualties? 5, versus the thousands that would have been otherwise devastated. This illustrates the 2-step process of preventive war. Write each step down as a separate subpoint. A, remove credible threat. Remember, this isn't the Israeli president waking up tomorrow after a little too much back medicine and saying, hey, let's go nuke Iran. That's not what we're talking about. Preventive war is Israel obtaining intelligence for years, acting on stated threats, trying other options, and once they know conflict to be unavoidable, stopping disaster. The threats are credible, but after preventive war, they're gone. Point 2, rapid return to peace. Once preventive war is resolved the threat, the conflict is over, period. Immediately after the danger is removed, the country will retreat and the conflict will end. Now I get it. None of us want war, but that doesn't mean we get to be afraid of it. Credible threats demand an adequate response. Preventive war provides a pretty rare scenario here. However, when the government's known not just once, but 5 individual times that 9/11 is coming, allowing it to destroy their citizens is completely unethical. Thanks.
Alrighty, so just going to set my timer to 3 minutes real quick. And then Luke, if you're ready. Perfect. Let's get started. I want to talk first off a little bit about your value, which is citizens' lives. Would you agree that even if you protect your citizens' lives, if you do it in an immoral way, then the action overall is immoral?
No, the protection of citizens' lives is the utmost ethical duty of the government. Therefore, it has to be their priority. Doing
Let's
so
say
is
you protect your citizens using chemical warfare. Is that chemical warfare moral?
I mean, using chemical warfare on them wouldn't really protect them.
No, not on your citizens, but to defend your citizens. Let's say you use chemical warfare on another nation and kill their innocent people. Would you agree that even though technically you're protecting your citizens, it's immoral?
One thing I want to clarify on that is, as presented in my value, we're specifically looking at threat situations, but I would argue if that chemical weapon is being used in the face of an unavoidable danger, then yes.
Okay, so you're saying that chemical warfare, if it's in front of if you believe that there's an unavoidable danger, that chemical warfare is morally justified as long as it protects citizens.
If you don't have other options, you have to do the ethical thing and protect the lives of your citizens. That's why we have government.
Sure. So would you agree that the ends don't justify the means?
I would actually argue the opposite.
You say that you believe that the ends do justify the means?
In threat situations.
Okay, so in threat situations, just to clarify your position, as long as we're protecting citizens, the action is ethical.
In threat situations, yes.
Interesting. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your definition of your definition of preventive war. So it does talk about a belief of inevitability, right?
Yes.
So essentially what that means is that based on the intelligence that we have, if we do nothing, a conflict is going to occur, right?
Right. It will invariably occur. There's no way of getting around that.
Okay, interesting. So I want to clarify also another part. It talked about how preventive war means that there isn't an imminent threat. Is that correct?
Yes, not imminent is a very vague term. It just basically means it's not happening in the next week.
Right, so it's not about to happen. Is that fair to say?
It's not happening the next week. Yeah.
So anytime we're talking about an attack or an act of war in the face of an imminent threat, then it's not really preventive war, right?
Right. If the threat is less than a week out, I would classify that as preemptive.
Okay, interesting. I want to talk a little bit about Operation Opera. So essentially in this scenario, Israel had intelligence that Iraq was making a nuclear bomb, and they decided to defend themselves and attack that nuclear bomb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Were there any civilian casualties?
Yes, as stated, there was 5.
Okay, so and the reason for this was, again, that they believed that conflict was inevitable, right?
Right. The president had literally come out saying that he wanted to destroy the nation with his nuclear weapons. There wasn't really a lot up in the air.
Okay, so essentially he said, did he specifically talk about that nuclear weapon, or did he just say overall?
No, he was specifically referencing that reactor.
Great, thanks. No further questions. I'll be using a minute of prep time. Alrighty, so no further prep time needed. I'm going to set my timer for 7 minutes, and then I'm just going to assume that everyone is ready and go ahead and get started. Mankind must put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind. John F. Kennedy. We can all agree that war is not something that a country should just throw around. However, the affirmative side creates a world where the only criterion necessary to justify an attack is a belief that the nation might be harmed sometime in the distant future. It is because this world is full of unnecessary conflict that preventive war can't be deemed ethical. There's one big problem with my opponent's case, and really just his moral framework overall. It's essentially his position that as long as we protect citizens' lives, then warfare is then ethical. However, this is an incredibly dangerous standard, and we'll be seeing that by looking at a couple contentions. But before I go on to that, I want to clarify two things about his definition of preventive war. The first point I want to clarify is belief of inevitability. Again, belief of inevitability. The fact of the matter is that nothing really in this world is certain. So while it is the country believes that it's inevitable, it's basically saying that if we do nothing, then we think that this is going to be inevitable. But my second response is that it's not an imminent threat. Again, it's not an imminent threat. See, it's not my position that in the face of a threat, we should do nothing. But rather, what I'm saying is that there are other options that can take place. If there is an imminent threat, then maybe we can defend ourselves, and that's really a situational basis. But really, I just want to clarify one thing. I'm not advocating for doing nothing, even though the affirmative might make it sound like I am. But with that in mind, I'd like to go to the value of the citizens' lives. I agree to this value, and I think we can use it in today's debate round, but I need to clarify one thing, which is simply that it's not enough. Again, it's not enough. Contrary to Luke's belief, I believe that even if we protect citizens' lives, if we do it through an unethical means like chemical warfare, then it's unethical. Because guess what? The ends don't justify the means. With that in mind, I'd like to present the criterion of the just war theory. The just war theory is a moral checklist for warfare. The just war theory has different criteria that must be met before an act of war is considered ethical. According to Oregon State University, the just war theory is the basis on which nations seek to legally and morally justify going to war. The history of the just war theory begins in the works of some important philosophers. Augustine provided a foundation for the just war theory in Western literature. Thomas Aquinas codified Augustine's reflections into the distinct criteria that remain the basis of just war theory as it is used today. What this means is that the standard used to decide preventive war is ethical is citizens' lives through the just war theory. And the reason why we need this criterion is because it keeps the means in check. See, only looking at the ends isn't looking at the full aspect of what makes an action ethical and moral. We need to be looking at the means as well. However, I believe that preventive war fails the just war theory. Contention 1, preventive war undermines the just war theory. Remember, the only criteria necessary to justify violence under preventive war is a belief that conflict is going to happen sometime in the future. If we say that preventive war is ethical, then we are allowing nations to skip the other criteria that are necessary to justify war. This is incredibly dangerous because it would deem ethical actions which are obviously unethical. We will be examining two of those criteria and using a real-world example to prove this point. Subpoint A, preventive war is not proportional. One of the most crucial criteria of the just war theory is that the action taken is a proportional response. However, with preventive war, the only information necessary to justify an attack is if an attack is going to happen, not what that attack is going to be. So how can your response be proportional if you don't even know what the attack is in the first place? I'm not saying that every preventive war is not proportional. Rather, if we establish preventive war as ethical, then we are allowing for violence that is not proportional and therefore unethical. But subpoint B is that preventive war is not a last resort. Another criterion of the just war theory is that the action taken is the last resort. In preventive war, the threat that is perceived is not imminent, so the attack itself is not about to happen. This means that there are always other options that can be used before a nation attacks. One of those options is economic sanctions. Instead of violence, a nation or group of nations can cut off trade to use as leverage. An example of this are the sanctions on North Korea. If preventive war is ethical, it would be moral for us to annihilate North Korea right now, but we haven't. Why? Because it's not the last resort. According to Joseph D. Thomas, M.D. Thomas, he talked about how because of our economic sanctions on North Korea, between 2015 and 2016, the exports they produced decreased by over $1 billion. These sanctions have opened the door for peace talks with North Korea. Diplomacy is another viable option that can be used to mitigate a conflict. The fact of the matter is that there are always other options before violence, and because of that, preventive war is never the last result. Ultimately, preventive war undermines the just war theory and is therefore unethical. I'd like to point out, if I can prove that the preventive war undermines just one criteria of the just war theory, then it's therefore deemed unethical. But let's look at the specific contention he presented. His contention is that an ethical government prevents disaster. I have one response: other options. Again, other options. Like I talked about in subpoint B, that there are always other options when the threat isn't imminent. This is really important because I'm not advocating for not trying to prevent a disaster. I think we should prevent a disaster, but there are other ways to do it. What does that mean? It means that preventive war is unnecessary. And that's my second response. Unnecessary war is unethical. Because there are other options, it makes preventive war unnecessary, which makes it unethical. But his first application was Operation Opera. I have one response. Unsuitable for making bombs. Again, unsuitable for making bombs. Dr. Rafael Ofek is an expert in the physics and technology of nuclear power. And he said, quote, first, the Osiris reactor that was bombed by Israel in June of 1981 was explicitly designed by a French engineer, Yoves Durard, to be unsuitable for making bombs. The fact of the matter is, the intelligence that Israel had was wrong. This is really important because he talked a lot about inevitability, but his own application shows that guess what? A belief of inevitability can be wrong because this reactor could never make bombs. And that's according to the person who designed it. But his second application was 9/11. He talked a lot about 9/11, how we could have stopped the attacks. My response is that innocent lives would have been lost. Again, innocent lives would have been lost. The LA Times reported Bill Clinton saying, quote, I nearly got him and I could have killed him. But I would have had to destroy a little town called Kandahar in Afghanistan and kill 300 innocent women and children, and then I would have been no more better than him. The reason why he didn't attack is because he understood that the means was unethical, which had made it as so then Bill Clinton would have been just as bad as the terrorists who attacked on 9/11. The fact of the matter is that just protecting innocent civilians isn't enough to create a moral standard. We need something to keep the means in check. Preventive war fails the just war theory and is therefore unethical. Thanks, and I'm ready for cross-examination.
All right, 3 minutes on the clock if you're ready.
Yep.
First, can we agree that preventive war exists in a threat situation?
It exists in a belief that there is a threat, yes.
Okay, so then we should evaluate this round based on the idea that we're evaluating it from the point of view as if we're in a threat situation.
Sure, as if we believe that there's a threat.
Can we agree that the belief mentioned in the definition is the belief of a military official?
Sure.
Can we agree that imminent equals soon?
Yes.
Is the 4th of July soon?
Is the 4th of July soon? It's in a couple months, so I would say no.
Okay, so then we can agree soon means quite close at hand.
Yeah.
All right. You brought up the idea of the just war theory. Can you provide me one example of a war in the past 250 years that met all 6 criteria of the just war theory?
Actually, I actually can give you an example. There was this bomb or this raid on Rasso Camp, and essentially it just stopped a military attack, and it met all the criteria of the just war theory.
Okay, so in the past 250 years, out of the hundreds of war that's been fought, we know of one that passed all the criterion of the just war.
I'm not an historian, and I have 3 minutes. I'm not going to give you over. I mean, if you want me to go ramble on about different examples.
Could you present a couple in your next speech?
I mean, I don't know if I want to waste time. The fact of the matter is the just war theory is the basis for what we use today. It's what.
Can we agree that just war theory seeks to affect justice?
And ethics, yes.
All right, and can we agree that just war theory specifically that you have to fit all 6 requirements in order for it to deem a war as just?
Yeah.
Did you address my resolutional analysis?
The ones talking about the prongs?
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of clarified the definition that it's a belief of inevitability and that we're not looking at an imminent threat. So I didn't.
Okay, but you didn't disagree with it.
I didn't necessarily disagree. I just clarified exactly what the definition means.
All right, so then we can agree that in a preventive war situation, we're looking at, we've already tried all the other available options, correct?
No, that's why I said belief of inevitability and the idea that it's not imminent, because if we don't know that the threat is imminent, then there's always other options to use.
Okay, but we can agree that I specifically stated we have to try other options in order to understand something to be inevitable.
I would not agree with that particularly. That's why I talked about a belief of inevitability. That's like to clarify that.
Can we agree that inevitable in essence means unavoidable?
Inevitable. I would have to see a definition of that. I don't really just want to straight up agree to that.
All right. Is it ever okay for the government to intentionally violate citizens' life?
To intentionally do it? Is it ever okay? I think that you would have to look at that from a situational basis.
I'm sorry, so you think there's instances in which it's ethically okay to intentionally kill your citizens?
Okay, well, then no. No, there's no... Sorry, I misunderstood your question. No, there is not a situation.
Great, no further questions. 3 minutes of preparation time begins now. No further prep time needed. I've got 1 minute and 13 seconds of prep remaining. I'm going to go ahead and put 4 minutes on my clock here. Presuming y'all can all hear me okay?
I hear you, Luke.
Great. Let's go ahead and jump in. I want to remind you of the situation of 9/11. 3,000 citizens killed. 6,000 injured. 5 failed attempts. This illustrates the tragic story of governments ignoring their responsibility. And it's because at the end of the day, we have to protect our citizens that I'm still resolved about preventive war being ethical. Before I jump into some direct refutation, I want to point out the 2 burdens of an affirmative ballot. The first thing I got to prove to you is that citizens' life is the ultimate standard of ethicality. And secondly, I need to prove that preventive war protects citizens. If I do those 2 things, I believe an affirmative ballot is warranted. Let's start with some quick refutation. Here about the idea of belief of inevitability, my response is that of military official. As we covered in cross-examination, this belief has to come from a military official, so it's a very credible belief, not just some hobo off the street. Next, you talked about not imminent, and my response is that of weak. Now, as we agreed in cross-examination, 4th of July isn't soon. The 4th of July is about a month and a half away, meaning that these threats being soon, which imminent equals soon, these threats being non-imminent simply means that they're more than like 30 days away. He brought up this idea about how he agrees to my value, but it's not enough. My response is that of threat situation. And I want to clarify all those issues with my value by pointing out there are instances in which protection of citizens has to take a slightly second role or needs to be held out level with ideas such as justice. Threat situations aren't one of those, which I've been saying since cross-examination. Now, he presented this criterion of the just war theory, and I'm going to be responding to the just war theory as well as his first contention with 2 main arguments. First, that of unusable. Now, in cross-examination, my opponent had 1 example of just war theory actually being fulfilled in the past 250 years, and it was some war we've never heard of, which consisted of 1 bomb. That pretty much explains the unrealistic requirements of just war theory. You see, the Revolutionary War technically wasn't proportional, but it was still ethical because it gained us our freedom. The idea of the Civil War technically wasn't just cause, but it still freed millions of slaves. Just because the just war theory has failed doesn't inherently mean something's non-ethical. So I reject it as the criterion for our debate. My second response, though, is that it doesn't affect ethics. Justice is a great concept, but our resolution specifically states ethics. Justice and ethics are separate moral concepts, and we can't interchange them. Something that proves justice doesn't prove ethics. About the application of North Korea, and my response is that of other options worked. Now, as outlined in my resolutional analysis, we must try all other options first. We tried other options in North Korea. They worked. This is great. We don't need preventive war. He brought up the idea about how we have other options, and my response is that of must fail. He never responded to my resolutional analysis. We've already talked about how in order to use preventive war, in order for something to be considered inevitable, these other options must have failed. Finally, he talked about how Operation Opera was unsuitable for making bombs. My response is that of retracted. The articles, all the articles about that were written by Mr. Richard Wilson, who was misled, and he later on officially retracted them. This evidence doesn't stand. And finally, he talked about 9/11 and how it would have killed 300 people. My response is that of failed responsibility. 9,000 people were potentially life-alteringly ended in order for him to not kill 300. And my second response, 5 attempts. He had 5 opportunities to do this. I'm pretty sure they weren't all the same exact scenario. We need a real response here. I've got those 2 main points I talked about in the beginning of my speech. Write the first one down as citizens' life equals ethics. Now, ethics is roughly defined as someone's moral duty. And as my opponent agreed in cross-examination, there is never a time where it's okay for a government to intentionally violate the lives of its citizens. Choosing not to act is an intentional violation. Which leads to my second point. Preventive war protects. I'm not arguing we become a new boogeyman. I'm not arguing we tackle every threat we see out of the corner of our eye. But when threats are truly credible, something not responded to, and when we've tried all other options, we have to react. And in order to react, we need an adequate response. Thanks.
Alrighty, so I have 2 minutes of prep time remaining, starting now. Alrighty. No further prep time needed. My timer is set for 6 minutes. I'm just going to assume that everyone is ready and go ahead and get started. According to my opponent's position, if we say that preventive war is ethical, then we're allowing for actions that are obviously unethical, because the only basis to justify warfare is if they believe that we're protecting our citizens. The fact of the matter is that that is not enough to determine a moral framework, and it's because we need something else that the resolution is false and that preventive war is unethical. Let's look at a couple of responses or arguments, and then I'll leave you with two main voting issues. Let's go straight to the definitions. Against the idea of belief of inevitability, he talked about how it's a military officials. My response is that they still can be wrong. Again, they still can be wrong. An example of this is Operation Opera, but I'll respond to his points under this argument a little bit later in a second. The next point, he talked about how it's not an imminent threat. He said a week. My response is it's about to happen. The definition of imminent threat means it's about to happen. The reason why I brought up this idea of imminence is for two reasons. First off, if the threat isn't imminent, then there's always other options that can be had, even if you think that a threat is inevitable. But secondly, because I'm not advocating for doing nothing. Again, my opponent would have you believe that if we don't say that preventive war is ethical, then therefore we can't do anything to defend ourselves. That's not true. We can still respond when in the face of an imminent threat. We can still use diplomacy. We can still use sanctions. And North Korea is a great example of that. But again, I'll clarify that when looking at that specific example. Against the value of citizens' lives, I talked about how it's not enough and we need the just war theory. He said that we're looking at threat situations. My response is belief of threats. Again, belief of threats. But my second response is that it's still necessary. The just war theory is still necessary. Just because we're looking at situations when we believe that there's a threat doesn't mean that we should just toss the just war theory out the window. Moving down, against the idea of other options, he talked about how those other options must fail. My response is belief of inevitability. Again, all we know is that we think that it's inevitable, and that if we do nothing, then guess what? War is going to happen or a conflict is going to happen. However, the problem is that because it's not an imminent threat, there's always other options that can be had. Again, unnecessary war is unethical, and that's a point that he never responded to. But moving down to Operation Opera, he talked about how it was retracted. And I don't remember the author's name, but it was something Wilson. And he said that this guy who did all of the evidence on this, or all the articles, retracted it. My response is simply a different author. This evidence is by Dr. Rafael Ofek, so I don't really know if this really applies. And what he said is that he actually visited the facility in 1982. And he said that many physicians and physicists, not physicians, and nuclear engineers have agreed that it was not suitable for making bombs. This just shows how intelligence can be wrong. And that's really the impact, because his only application of true preventive war that he's used shows that it's only a belief of inevitability, and that you can be wrong, and that there are always other options. Against 9/11, he talked about how we failed responsibility in 5 attempts. My response is unethical. If Bill Clinton would have killed those 300 innocent people in an attempt to get Osama bin Laden, then it would have been unethical. That's very clear. Let's talk about the two main arguments he presented with the just war theory, because this was the meat of his case. His first point was that it's unusable. And he said I only could bring up one example. I'd like to point out I had 3 minutes of cross-examination, and I'm not going to waste my time listing a bunch of examples. But I have 3 main responses. The first response is international law. Again, international law. The idea that it's not used is actually completely false, because the just war theory is the basis of international law. My second response is that it's currently used by the U.S. Again, it's currently used by the U.S. Guess why Bill Clinton didn't attack? Because it violated the just war theory. It's what's currently being used. The idea that it's unusable is actually incorrect. But my third and final response is it's still necessary. He still hasn't responded to the main argument that I want to put forward today. The idea that just looking at the ends is not enough to justify a moral framework. Because guess what? If we only look at citizen lives, then literally every single action under warfare is justified. And that is absolutely dangerous and will 1000% be abused. And a great example of this is North Korea. Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un were exchanging threats left and right. Kim Jong-un was testing missiles in our backyard. You could find enough evidence based on just looking at the New York Times to say that a threat was inevitable, that a conflict was inevitable. But guess why we didn't use preventive war? Because it wasn't the last resort. And unnecessary warfare is unethical. But finally, let's go down to the second argument, that it doesn't affect ethics. My response is that it's the basis of ethics. Again, it's the basis of ethics. Just because it says the word just and not the word ethical doesn't mean that it's not the basis of ethics. But then the final argument about North Korea is that the other options worked. My response is that it's unnecessary war. Again, if we would have attacked North Korea, it would have been unnecessary. And my second response is an affirmative contradiction. He agreed that in the face of an inevitable threat, other options worked. That completely destroys his whole entire argument about how that means that the other options have failed. With that in mind, I'd like to present you two voting issues. The first voting issue is belief of inevitability. Again, belief of inevitability. The fact of the matter is that there isn't an imminent threat, and that I'm not advocating for doing nothing, because if the threat isn't imminent, there's always other options. But my second voting issue is preventive war fails the just war theory. And it does it for two reasons. Firstly, it allows for unethical actions. Again, it allows for unethical actions. But secondly, because it promotes unnecessary war. Because it makes it so that you can attack without exhausting all your options, without having enough intel to know if your response will be proportional. If we allow preventive war to be ethical, then we are literally justifying any action in warfare according to my opponent's own moral framework. And for that reason, it's unethical. Thank you.
I have 1 minute and 13 seconds of preparation time remaining, and I'll start that now. All right, enough for the preparation time necessary. 3 minutes on the clock. All right. Something very interesting happened in the last speech. My opponent made a lot of responses, but the two main points I said winning an affirmative ballot literally went unrefuted. So those 2 points still stand. I'll be reiterating my voting issues in just a second, but first we'll respond to his arguments. In response to the idea of still can be wrong, about to happen, and belief of inevitability, simply write down high threshold. He can't refute the fact that these are trained military officials, and he also can't refute the fact that imminent just means very soon. Once again, I asked him in cross-ex if 1.5 months away was soon, and he said no. So we're just talking about being 25, 30 days out. He brought this idea of belief of a threat, and it's still necessary. My response to both of these is that of threat situation. As clarified from the beginning of the debate round, we're only looking at threat situations, and that's what we need to focus on here. He brought up the idea of only think it's inevitable. My response is that of other options prove inevitability. I've been arguing this from the very beginning of the debate round. We won't know it's inevitable until we try all the other options. It's a logical prerequisite to the definition, and he hasn't been able to disprove that fact. He brought up the idea about how he has a different author, and my response is that of specialized chemical. It doesn't refute the fact that, as stated in my very first speech, this Operation Opera was using a specific chemical, uranium-235, that has no purpose other than making nukes. There was no other reason, and those quotations never responded to. He brought up the idea about how 9/11 would have been unethical. My response is that of would have protected 9,000. It would have protected 9,000 civilians, and this is a direct contradiction to what he said earlier. I actually believe it would have been ethical to protect 9,000 people from a horrendous terrorist attack. Now, my response to everything about the just war theory is simply doesn't affect ethics. And there's two main subpoints here. First, unusable. He still hasn't actually provided any examples other than one freak bombing accident of this being used in the real world. He never refuted the fact that the Revolutionary War would have failed it or the Civil War, and he never got around from the fact that we don't actually see it physically working. While I agree it's an interesting standard and might have worked with stones and clubs, in the modern age, it isn't used and is flat out ignored. My second subpoint is that of different standard. This is a totally different standard. It's not ethicality. It doesn't apply. My first voting issue you can write down as citizens' lives equals ethics. And in my cross-examination, I asked my opponent if there's ever a time where it's ethical to intentionally kill your citizens. And he said no. And I still stand by a claim I made in my last speech. doing nothing is harming your citizens. That brings me to my second voting issue. It's that of preventive war protects. At the end of the day, preventive war takes action against credible threats, something my opponent's not really been able to refute, and upholds ethics by keeping citizens alive. I agree it's not pretty, but choosing to do nothing and choosing to allow our citizens to be wiped off the face of the earth isn't an ethical option. Thanks.
Great job, Luke.
Thank you. Fun round.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good job.
Time today. Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Great job.
Thank you.